Welcome back. In this lecture for ECO303, we are going to cover some key terms and concepts. Now, these are ideas that are fundamental to the ideas that we will explore through the rest of the semester. And even if we don't directly build off of all of them, they are at the heart and at the root of much of what we will be building and constructing over the rest of the semester. Addressing these now will save us needing to come back and address them separately and in a haphazard slipshod fashion in the weeks to come. Now, when we ended the last lecture, we were talking about how economics is the study of human action and interaction in a world of limited resources and unlimited wants. And now we've discussed what it means to have wants instead of needs. And that this then means that economics is fundamentally the study of choice, influenced by information and incentives. Now, these information and these incentives often come about in the context of a market. And that's our first term. So that's the term that we're going to start with. Let's start with our first term, market. What is a market? It's a little more than just the stand by the road where you can buy your fresh corn. A market is an exchange of goods or services. A market is where trade and exchange, where economic activity takes place. But it's not necessarily a physical location. It's a little more ethereal in that. A market is the exchange itself. So you can have a market in beans, or a market in tires, or a market in baseball bats. And that is all the buying and selling activity, all the production and consumption that occurs related to that good. Our second key term for today will be benefit, or as some economists call it, utility. This is quite simply the good that is done by the consumption of a product, an action, a gift, an exchange. Right? This is the positive that accrues to me by an economic activity or an economic choice. This is what I gain. The benefit for you is what you gain, and is weighed on the positive side against my cost or against your cost. How much good do I receive from eating an apple? How much good do I receive from walking through a door? How much good do I receive from turning a doorknob? Right? I expend energy to turn that doorknob or open that door. Is it worth it? Well, it is if I expect to receive more benefit than the cost of expending the energy to open that door. Now, interestingly enough, benefit is also tied to our next subject, to our next key term, and that is value. And value and benefit to a person, the value of an action is the benefit of that action. So the value of working out is the benefit that I get from becoming stronger, from gaining more endurance, from having better cardiovascular health. The value of working out is the benefit that I receive. The benefit that I receive is the value of working out. When you're talking about what a person receives, value and benefit are pretty much interchangeable, but value has an additional meaning. Value also means market worth. There we go. Or as it's more often known, market value. And simply what this means is what is the value that is determined by the market. Now, as we talked about a minute ago, market is a non-specific, it's the non-specific exchange and interaction for the economic good. How does that determine value? Well, simply by understanding benefit is linked to value. Values are very subjective. And that fact has been at the heart of some economic errors in the past, including by some pretty well-known figures. But value is a subjective thing. The value of an activity, of an item, of a product, of a service is the benefit that it does me, or the benefit that it does for you, or the benefit that it does for my colleague, or the benefit that it does for whoever is consuming that product, that good, that service. And this value can be different. It's subjective. This is what allows trades to take place. This is what creates the phrase, one man's trash is another man's treasure. Subjective value allows yard sales to take place. I'm sure there are goods that you value very highly that I would have little use for. And because I have little use for them, they would be of little benefit to me. Thus, I would have very small value for them. Similarly, there are things I would value quite highly that you have little use for. And if you were selling in a garage sale for a few dollars, I would happily buy and praise my good fortune and the blessing that allowed me to find it. Now, I mentioned there have been some errors with regard to value in the past. The most prominent of these is the labor theory of value, the labor theory of value. And the labor theory of value has been espoused by thinkers such as Adam Smith, Marx, and many others. And it's wrong. It's wrong. See, the labor theory of value purports that the value of an object, the value of an item, is determined by the quantity of labor that went into producing it. This is a tempting thought. Should something that takes a craftsman 100 hours to make be worth more than something that takes a moderately skilled worker 6 hours to make? Perhaps. Depends on who's buying it. Right again, go back to markets. Go back to the concept of the market. The markets are these exchanges for goods and services. And the price that people are willing to pay is determined by the benefit that they expect to receive from the good and service at every level of the market. That determines the value of the good. And so if I spend 100 hours digging a hole in my backyard with a teaspoon, is that hole worth more than the hole that my son digs in 3 hours with a spade? No. It's still a hole. It does the same function. Both work just fine to plant a new bush. If I spend 6 years building a car with my bare hands, is that car worth 6 years of my wage? Maybe, maybe not. Does that car that I spent 6 years building with my bare hands do anything better than the car that is turned out in a matter of hours by a modern assembly line? And that costs 1/12 the amount. Again, maybe, maybe not. Some of the guys who collect classic cars would love hand-built, hand-restored cars, mostly because there's no other way to get them. But again, it's because to those individuals, such a car has tremendous benefit, irrelevant of the amount of time it took me to come up with it, irrelevant to the amount of time it took to make it. So value is subjective, is based on the benefit that an individual expects to receive and obtain and gain, the benefit they expect to accrue by consuming a good. Our next term is capital. Capital doesn't mean the capital of a nation, the capital of a state. Those are important, obviously, but to economists, capital means the resources. An economist, capital means the resources that are available to be put to a specific use. The resources available for a particular use, that is the capital. And there are four primary kinds of capital that we will talk about today. The first is physical capital. Right? Physical capital refers to the physical resources that can be put to a particular use. This stylus is physical capital. The computer I'm recording this lecture on is physical capital. My car is physical capital. The building I sit in is physical capital. The computer you're watching this on is physical capital. The tractor in the field, the blacksmith's forge, the factory's assembly line, the delivery truck, the mining equipment, the airplane, the ocean freighter. These things are all physical capital. Tools, equipment, machinery, transportation. Physical capital, the resources available to be put to a specific use. The next kind of capital is financial. And financial capital is the financial resources available to be put to a specific use. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean all the financial resources in the possession of an individual or a corporation. It means the resources that are available. If I am a wealthy man, but all my money is tied up in real estate and I can't access it, I have a very low amount of financial capital at that point in time. The third common type of capital is human. And human capital are the resources, the skills, the talents, the abilities, the inclinations, the education that you have within yourself. That is human capital. And so you take college classes to increase your human capital. You learn skills to increase your human capital. You train at a sport or in martial arts or in dance or in any other physical activity to increase your human capital. You memorize knowledge and information and formulas and methods and procedures to increase your human capital. Right? Your inbuilt or in-developed resources carried within yourself that are available to be put to a particular productive use. That is human capital. Everybody has it. Now, there is a little bit of confusion sometimes when you start talking about employees. Are employees human capital for a business, or are they physical capital for a business? Economists go both ways on that, and usually you can figure it out by context. But sometimes when you see human capital, they're talking about employees of a business. But usually they're talking about the inbuilt skills within yourself. The fourth and final kind of capital that we will talk about is religious. Now, religious capital, scratch that. The fourth and final type of capital that we will talk about today is social. Now, social capital is the resources available from our friends, from others, from other people. Social capital are the friendships that we can call on, the contacts we can call on, our network of people who we have dealt with, who we have a good reputation with, who know us, who are willing to go out on a limb for us. That is social capital. Social capital is built through friendships. It is built through trustworthiness. It's built through having a good business reputation, a good reputation among your social group, having an expansive social network. These are all social capital. Now, there are other forms of capital. Mostly they don't come into the discussion to any great extent. Our next point that we will talk about is government. And this one may seem obvious. Right? Why government? Doesn't everybody know what government is? Well, economists have a very interesting way of talking about government. And in particular, government boils down to one thing. Government boils down to force. Why do I say that a government is force? Simply this: no matter the interaction, no matter how benign it seems, ultimately, if you say no and keep saying no, force comes into play. Governments are force. More specifically, governments are a monopoly on the socially acceptable use of force. If you want, you could go even more specifically and say that governments are a monopoly on the determination of the socially acceptable use of force. But it boils down to force, and ultimately lethal force. Think about it. You walk your dog without a leash. You get cited, right? It's local citation of some kind. You say no, you don't pay. What happens? Well, maybe there's a lien on a piece of property that you own. Maybe you get a court date, a summons of some kind, depending on where you live. What if you say no? What happens? And then what happens if you keep saying no? And then what happens if you keep saying no? Ultimately, men with guns come to try to enforce compliance with some element in the process. And what happens if you keep saying no? And keep saying no? No matter how benign the interaction starts, government is ultimately force. What if it doesn't start with a violation, right? What if it starts with failure to secure a permit to cut somebody's hair in your house? You say, no, I don't need to get a permit, and it starts there. Now, keep saying no. I hope you can see that ultimately every aspect of government ultimately comes back to force. Ultimately and eventually comes back to force. So if government is the entity that is able to use power to coerce, right? To coerce a change in behavior, to coerce particular behaviors, whether to create socially desirable behaviors or to disincentivize socially undesirable behaviors. This has an interesting implication for what a government is. Namely this: not all entities that claim to be governments are, from an economic perspective, actually functioning as governments. And not all entities that are actually functioning as governments are formally claiming to be governments. One example would be the various areas in Mexico and South America where there is a formal government of an area, but they actually have much less power and much less influence than do the drug cartels. And so you can run into a situation very easily where a drug cartel is the effective government of a town, even though it doesn't carry that name. And the entity that does carry the name of government has no real power, and thus doesn't function as a government. Okay, so governments need not be formalized, and formalization doesn't make a government. No, rather it is the ability to wield power. Now this leads directly into our understanding of the next key term, which is liberty or freedom. And this is vital when we talk about free and voluntary exchange or free markets or any other free activity. And despite the various, aside from the various philosophical or political definitions of what it is to be free, economists have a very, very peculiar understanding of what it is to be free. And in particular, to an economist, freedom means the ability to have the decision-making authority, right? To the ability to decide and have sole influence over both the object and the fruits of your work. And that's important. Both of those elements are important. The object and the fruits of your work. In other words, what you do with your time, with your labor, with your blood, sweat, and tears, and what you do with the outcome, the fruits of your blood, sweat, and tears. Right? You have both the ability to determine your efforts, the object of your efforts, and to determine the disposition of the fruit of those efforts. That is what it is to be free from an economist's perspective. If I let you decide what you do to be productive, but then I take all of your effort, right? If I take all of the fruits, you're not free. You're beholden to me in some very real way because I have taken everything that you have earned. There's probably a little piece of you that speaks up and says, "Boy, that's unjust." That's a very good reaction. It certainly is. On the other hand, if I say to you, you are perfectly free to determine what to do with the fruits of your activity, but I will determine what you do. Again, you're not free. And so to be free from an economic perspective is to have the sole discretion and decision-making authority over the object and fruits of your labor. Now, if you think about this, if you think about the application to this, that means that taxes of any kind are an impingement on economic freedom, as are zoning regulations, as are business licenses. Right? Anytime you tell somebody, no, you can't do that until you get a permission slip to do so, or no, you can't keep all of what you earned, or no, I'm sorry, you can't build that in this place, you have to build it over there instead, or you can't use your land in this way. Or the EPA comes in and says, no, you can't modify this wetlands or this stream bed to be more profitable, to be more productive, to be safer for your kids to play around because it's a wetlands. All of these things are impingements on economic liberty, on what it is to be free. I would go so far as to say that even though this isn't the philosophical or political definition, the economic definition does indeed cover virtually all of the aspects of the political and philosophical definitions. It's something that we can definitely discuss. By this standard, there is no society that has been 100% free. That's okay. That's okay. We don't need to deal with absolute freedom. It's the Platonic ideal. It's the benchmark. It's the standard that we should try to live up to. We're not expected to obtain it because even with a minimum size government, there will be some infringement on pure economic freedom. And it's true, we do need some minimum size government. I'm sure we'll talk about that as we go this semester. But just be aware that every increase in taxes, every increase in regulatory authority, every increase in oversight necessarily includes a decrease in liberty. Our next point is contract or contracts. And contract is simply an agreed upon exchange. It's a voluntary agreement freely entered into by two or more parties that is binding on them in some way. Now, usually this is enforced by some sort of outsider, some sort of third party or group. Not always, usually. Contracts are amazing. They're necessary. They're absolutely necessary for an economic way of life in a modern sense. We could not have a modern economy or even really a modern way of life without having contracts. In short, and this is why contracts are so important, contracts allow us to coordinate and conduct exchanges across distance, across geographic distance, and across chronological distance. Through contracts, we were able to conduct exchanges across space and time. Now, some of this seems obvious, right? If I pay you money now for grain that you will deliver in 6 months, that's a contract, and that's a necessary contract. In fact, that might even be a contract we put in paper, or if you and I enter into a business agreement whereby I provide you with raw materials and you provide me with finished product, or we swap raw materials that we turn into intermediate goods for each other, or some sort of business arrangement of that type. These are things that might be formalized and might be directly enforceable, have an enforcement mechanism built into them by a court system, using a court system as our third party enforcer. But contracts really go a whole lot deeper than that. There's a much subtler, much more important point. When you buy something online, you're entering into a contract. You're paying up front, and the deal is happening across time and space. The money goes to the seller. The seller then sends the product to you. Why do you trust that that happens? Well, because we have a social understanding of contract. In fact, it goes farther than that. What about when a grocery store allows you to put goods in your cart before you pay for them? Do you just run out the front door of the grocery store? No. And if you did, if everybody did, grocery stores would have to dramatically change their operations, and it would become more expensive. Going to a grocery store would be much more of a hassle. Maybe you'd have to be helped. Maybe the shelves would be locked. Maybe the gates of the grocery store would lock behind you as you went in. I don't know how it would best be solved, but it would be substantially more annoying than the system that we have now, which is only possible with a system of informal, implicit contract. And as we're going to see several times during this semester, the social cultures, the social mores that underlie some of these fundamental aspects of the economy are incredibly important. All right, so contracts are important because they allow exchange across space and time. And they can be formal or informal. And the informal contracts are at least as important as the formal ones. Remember, the contracts are agreements that are freely entered into. Well, this brings us to our next key term, and that is free and voluntary exchange. Free and voluntary exchange. This is incredibly important. Free and voluntary exchange is probably the single most important concept that we're talking about here in this section. And it is so utterly important because only through free and voluntary exchange, A, can you respect the economic freedom and liberty of other individuals, but also B, only through free and voluntary exchange can you ensure that wealth is being created. How so? Well, it's like this. If I want to trade you something, say this pen, and I offer to sell it at a price of $2, and you happen to be in a position where you really need a pen. Perhaps normally you wouldn't pay $2 for a pen when you can buy it at the store for less than that, but today you find yourself in an urgent need for a pen, perhaps to complete an exam to earn your grade. And so because of the benefit that you expect to gain from completing that exam, the value of the pen to you at that point in time is $5. And so if I value the pen at $2 and you value the pen at $5, this leaves room for free and voluntary trade. Any price greater than $2 and less than $5 is a price that we could conceivably reach. So let's say we settle on a price of $3. put a star there at that. If the pen is worth $5 to you and the pen is worth $2 to me, at a market price of $3, we will be willing to trade. I sell the pen to you, you pay me $3 for it, I gain $1 by that transaction. You purchase the pen from me at a price of $3, it's worth $5 to you, you essentially get $5 worth of pen for the discounted price of $3. So you essentially gain $2 also. What's happened is that society has had wealth created that is equal to the difference between the value that you put on the product and the value that I put on this product. It's kind of amazing. That is true regardless of the sticker price, regardless of the market price, regardless of the price that you actually pay me for this pen. If you value the pen at $5 and I value the pen at $2, it doesn't matter whether the price we reach is $2.01 or $4.95 or $3 or $2.50 or $4.25. The price is irrelevant. Society gains by the difference in value between the value that I place on this pen and the value you place on this pen when we transfer this pen from me to you. And that is only possible in a certain way. By certain, I mean assured way, through free and voluntary exchange. Right? If we try to coerce this transaction, if government tells me that I have to give the pen to you, we have no assurance that I actually value the pen less than you do. We have no assurance that this is true. If government tells me that I have to transfer a product or a service to you, this might be the case, and so value might be created, but it also might be true that whereas you value the pen at $5, perhaps instead of valuing the pen at $2, I actually value the pen at $6. And if that's the case, if I value the pen more than you do, and I'm told by government that I have to sell you this pen at some price, then wealth is being destroyed. So only through free and voluntary exchange can we ensure that people actually make trades, make exchanges, participate in market transactions when it is mutually beneficial. To reprise, mutually beneficial trade occurs when individuals are free to voluntarily trade. And they trade based on the understanding, based on the belief that they will benefit, that they will have increased benefit from obtaining that product, that good, that service for themselves, or from selling it, as the case may be. Now let's move on to our next concept. And that concept answers the question of, well, why would people be very interested? Why would they behave like this? Why would they seek their own benefit? Why would they seek to increase the benefit, to increase the wealth of society? And that is through the concept of self-interest. Now, self-interest is simply the idea that we do things that we like, that we do things that we want. And this sounds like selfishness, but it isn't. Self-interest is simply the driving force that surrounds everything that we do. Why did I put on shoes this morning? Well, because it's uncomfortable to walk around in bare feet all day. And in a professional environment, it's frowned upon. Why do I care? Well, in the first case, because of physical pain. In the second case, because I try to make a good impression on people who I happen upon in my day-to-day life. That's self-interest. Is it selfish to put on shoes? Not in most cases, not most of the time. Why do I pick out clean clothes to wear? Why do I eat food? Why do I drive safely? Is it selfish to drive safely? No. Is it self-interested? Yes, certainly it is. So there are very clearly areas of self-interest that are not selfishness. Now, what is selfishness? Whereas self-interest is pretty well defined as simply having a motivation and a reason to do things, selfishness, I find it helpful at least to define selfishness as focusing on your narrow self-interest to the exclusion of the values and benefits of others. So for example, if I focus on doing things in my own personal life around my house that I like to the exclusion and unaware or to thoughtless of the benefits for my wife, for my kids, that will be selfishness. Right? If I only understand my own narrow self-interest and do not allow my self-interest to be influenced by the self-interest of others, that is selfishness. Can it be Can an action be selfish or unselfish depending on context? Of course it can. Say eating the last slice of pizza, is it selfish? Well, if you're all alone, you're the person who bought the pizza, no, it's not selfish. Whereas if you are in the company of others, somebody else is very hungry, and perhaps you shared the price of the pizza or something, and you just don't think about their perspective, and you wolf down that last slice of pizza, perhaps that was selfish. In the first case, where you're all alone, there is nobody else's benefit to take into account. In the second case, there is. Okay, so there's a difference between self-interest and selfishness. Now, here's a question, and this is a question that is debated by economists, and this is something else that we can talk about. It'll probably be a fruitful area for discussion. Is it possible that all actions are self-interested? Where does that leave charity? Where does that leave selflessness? Are charitable actions self-interested? Are selfless actions self-interested? What about sacrificing yourself for somebody else? Some economists take the perspective that all actions are driven by self-interest once it's rightly understood. I tend to fall into this camp. This camp of economists, myself included, tend to believe that self-interest, once you understand what's really going on, once you understand the entire scope of the benefit functions that have been included in the decision-making individual's understanding of benefit, that all actions are explainable by self-interest. The other camp of economists tend to believe that no, not all actions are explainable by self-interest. This leaves them with only the alternative of calling many actions irrational. To these economists, charitable work is irrational. Things that don't benefit you, the actor, are irrational. Sacrificing your life for somebody else is irrational. Making sacrifices of your career, of your comfort, of your pleasure, of your hobbies, whatever else for your spouse are irrational. I don't really like this because I believe it can be very rational to do that. I'm a father. I have kids. Can I think of a situation where I would lay down my life for my kids? Yeah, I certainly can. And the New Testament tells us the greater love has no man than this, right? That he lay down his life for his friends. Now, are we to assume that that example of a great man with great love is irrational? I prefer to think of it as that great man, that great friend, the husband, the father, the soldier who lays down his life for his comrades, they're all acting very rationally, but they're understanding the benefit functions of the people who they are saving. So self-interest is a very broad concept, and it's often misunderstood. A misunderstanding of self-interest often leads people to ask me questions like, well, isn't the economy driven on greed? Isn't the free market necessarily selfish? The answer to both those questions is no, it isn't. What it is driven by self-interest. It doesn't work if self-interest doesn't exist. Self-interest is a necessary survival function. Self-interest is why we eat food. Self-interest is why we sleep. Self-interest is why we drive safely. Self-interest is why we study. Self-interest is why we pray. We can talk about that one. Anyway, what I want you to take away from this is that self-interest is fundamental, is foundational. Everything makes a lot more sense when you start looking at it from the perspective of trying to understand and discover the self-interested reasons why people behave in the ways that they do. Be willing to think of self-interest as including the benefit for other individuals. The last key term I want to talk about today in this lecture is the concept of marginal. And this will come up again pretty quickly as we begin to get in more depth into the theories and concepts of economics. Marginal simply means at the margin, at the edge. For example, price of toothpaste rises by 5 cents. Does that mean that everybody in the country stops buying toothpaste? No, of course not. What it does mean is that there's somebody in the country that doesn't buy a particular tube of toothpaste. They may even still buy one tube, but now instead of buying two, they buy one. Or instead of buying three, they only buy two. There's a marginal change in consumption. Marginal means at the edge, one less, one more. That's what marginal means to an economist. All right. Thank you very much. Look forward to discussing this with you